Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's go. The Library of the Forgotten. It all started with a storm. The kind of storm that makes you feel like the world is folding in on itself. I was driving home from work, fighting through torrential rain that slapped against the windshield like a warning. The GPS on my phone flickered, then went dark altogether. I must have taken a wrong turn because the road I found myself on wasn't familiar. Tall trees lined the narrow path, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The headlights caught glimpses of a sign, weathered and nearly illegible. Ashwick Public Library. I pulled over, partly out of curiosity and partly because I needed directions. Who had ever heard of a library out here in the middle of nowhere? The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted bike leaned against a lamppost. The building itself was old, the kind of old that feels alive. Ivy crawled up its stone facade, and the windows were dark, save for a faint golden glow coming from inside. It felt wrong, but something compelled me to step inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a sprawling interior that was much larger than the outside suggested. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, filled with books of all shapes and sizes. A musty smell hung in the air, the scent of old paper and forgotten things. "Can I help you?" The voice startled me. I turned to see an elderly man standing behind a wooden desk, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a tweed suit that seemed a century out of date, and his eyes glimmered with something I couldn't quite place. I'm lost," I stammered. "Everyone who comes here is," he said cryptically. There was something unsettling about his tone, but before I could respond, he gestured to the shelves. "Feel free to look around. You might find what you're looking for." I didn't know what he meant, but I wandered deeper into the library anyway. The books were strange. None of them had titles on their spines, just plain covers of varying colors. I picked one at random and flipped it open. Lena Everett, 1993. I froze. That was my name. I turned to the next page, and there was my birth date, followed by a detailed account of my childhood. Every scrape, every tear, every laugh. It was all there, written as though someone had been watching me my entire life. My stomach turned as I read about my teenage years, the heartbreaks, the mistakes. Then I flipped to the last written page, which described the storm, the wrong turn, and my arrival at the library. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. This couldn't be real. But curiosity clawed at me, urging me to keep reading. I opened the book again, and my breath caught in my throat. The next page was blank. But as I stared at it, words began to appear, written in neat black script. Lena turned the page, unaware that her decision would seal her fate. My hands trembled. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "Your story." The old man's voice came from behind me, making me jump. He stood there, his face unreadable. "Who's writing this?" I demanded. "You are," he said simply. "Every choice you make fills the pages. Every step you take writes the next chapter." I wanted to put the book back, to leave and never return, but my hands wouldn't obey me. "Why is it blank? What happens next?" "That depends on you," he said. "But I warn you, some stories are better left unread." I didn't listen. I couldn't. I read the next line. Lena decided to stay, drawn by the mystery of the library. It felt like an instruction, so I followed it. I turned another page, and more words appeared. She ventured deeper, ignoring the whispers that followed her. Whispers. I hadn't heard them before, but now that the book mentioned them, they filled the air. Soft, hissing voices that seemed to come from the books themselves. I looked around, heart pounding. The shelves stretched endlessly, their shadows long and foreboding. Turning another page, I read. The shelves weren't empty. The books were watching her. A chill ran down my spine. "What is this place?" I asked, but the old man was gone. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the library. My book was guiding me, each page lighting the path ahead. I passed more books, their covers quivering as though alive. At one point, I stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection showed the shelves behind me, but I wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows, faceless and pale. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The next page in my book read, "She should have run." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the book. My heart was racing, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't stop. I turned another page. The books were alive. Each one held the story of a soul trapped within the library. "No," I whispered. I turned again. She realized too late that the library wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. I ran. The shelves seemed to shift around me, the aisles twisting and changing. No matter how far I went, I couldn't find the exit. The whispers turned into screams, books flying off the shelves, their pages flapping like wings. I stopped in front of a new book lying open on a pedestal. The name on the first page wasn't mine. Ian Everett, 1990, 2021. My husband. "No!" I screamed, slamming the book shut. The shelves trembled, the air growing thick. I turned back to my book, desperate to find an answer, but the next page was horrifyingly clear. Her story would end in the Library of the Forgotten. I don't know how long I've been here. The library doesn't let you leave once you've found your book. I hear the whispers, feel the eyes of the faceless figures watching me. My story is almost finished. I can see the last blank page waiting for me. If you ever see a weathered sign for the Ashwick Public Library, turn around. Don't go inside. Because once you do, you'll never leave. The Watcher in the Well. They call it the Devil's Eye. At the heart of our quiet little town, hidden behind a rusted iron gate and surrounded by weeds, sits an ancient stone well. The stories about it go back generations. Everyone knows the legends, but no one admits to believing them. Except, maybe, for me now. When I first moved to Blackburn, the well was just another local oddity. I was fresh out of college, taking a teaching job at the high school and renting a cheap apartment downtown. The well was a landmark, a spot where kids dared each other to toss in coins and whisper wishes, or where old-timers spun tales of curses and madness. "Don't stare into it," Mrs. Calloway, my elderly neighbour, warned when she saw me walking by one day. Not for too long. That's how it starts. I laughed it off at the time. A well? Cursed? It sounded ridiculous, but Mrs. Calloway's trembling hands and the way her voice cracked with fear stuck with me. I didn't think much more about it until the night of the storm. The power went out around 8 p.m, plunging my tiny apartment into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to read by their flickering light, but the howling wind and pounding rain made it impossible to concentrate. After an hour of restless pacing, I grabbed my raincoat and decided to go for a walk. The storm had mostly passed by then, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the pale light of a crescent moon. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and ozone. Without really thinking about it, My feet carried me toward the center of town, toward the well. The gate was ajar when I got there, its rusty hinges creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, hearing Mrs. Calloway's warning in my head, but curiosity won out. I stepped through the gate and approached the well. Up close, it looked even older than I'd imagined. The stones were weathered and moss-covered, the mortar between them cracked and crumbling. A wooden bucket hung from a frayed rope, swaying gently as though moved by unseen hands. I peered over the edge, expecting to see nothing but darkness. Instead, I saw a reflection. It wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I must have imagined it, a trick of the light maybe, or my own face distorted by the shadows. But when I looked again, the reflection was still there. It was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. His features were indistinct, as though they'd been blurred with charcoal. Only his eyes were sharp, two piercing points of light that seemed to cut straight through me. I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more details emerged. His shoulders were hunched, his hands claw-like and resting on the edge of the well as though he were preparing to climb out. And then he moved. I gasped and stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to climb. I ran. By the time I reached my apartment, my clothes were soaked through and my lungs burned from exertion. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The storm, the shadows, the reflection, it was all just my imagination running wild. But then the dream started. Each night I dreamed of the well. I saw the figure climbing out, its movements slow and deliberate. It always stopped just before reaching the surface, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. During the day I felt off, paranoid, watched. I started avoiding windows and mirrors, terrified of what I might see in my reflection. I even tried going back to the well in broad daylight, hoping to prove to myself that it was just a normal, harmless piece of local history. But when I looked down into its depths, the water was still and empty. At least, until I turned to leave. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the ripple. The whispers started a week later. I'd be brushing my teeth or washing dishes, and I'd hear it. A soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come back," it said one night, so clearly I dropped the plate I was holding. I stopped leaving the apartment after that. I called in sick to work, ignored the concerned knocks from Mrs. Calloway, and spent most of my time sitting in the corner of the living room, as far from any reflective surfaces as possible. But the whispers didn't stop, and neither did the dreams. On the 9th night, I woke up to find my feet already moving, carrying me toward the door. I tried to stop myself, but it was like I was a puppet, my strings pulled by some invisible force. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices all urging me toward the well. When I reached it, the gate was wide open. The figure was waiting for me, its clawed hands resting on the edge of the stones. "Why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just pointed downward, toward the dark water. I leaned over, compelled by a force I couldn't resist, and for the first time, I saw what lay beneath the surface. Faces. Hundreds of them, their features twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. And then I saw mine. I don't remember falling in. All I know is that I'm here now, in the darkness. If you ever find yourself in Blackburn, stay away from the well. Don't look into it, not even for a second. Because once you see the Watcher, he sees you too. The vanishing pet. I've always been a dog person. Growing up, we had a golden retriever named Sandy who was my constant companion. When Sandy passed away, it felt like I'd lost a part of myself. Years later, when my husband Ian and I bought a little house in a quiet neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was Ian's idea to go to the shelter. "Let's see if we connect with one," he said one Saturday morning, his coffee steaming in the crisp autumn air. The shelter was a cacophony of barks and wagging tails. Every kennel seemed to hold a hopeful pair of eyes. But I wasn't feeling that click everyone talks about. That's when I saw him. He wasn't in a kennel, but sitting quietly near the back door, almost blending into the shadows. He was medium-sized, with sleek black fur and amber eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "That's Shadow," a volunteer said, noticing my interest. He was found wandering the woods nearby. No microchip, no tags. He's unusually calm. Shadow tilted his head, and for a moment I could have sworn he smiled. I knelt down, extending my hand. "Hey there, buddy." He trotted over without hesitation, his eyes locked on mine. When his cold nose nudged my palm, I felt an inexplicable pull. "We'll take him," I said, not even looking at Ian for confirmation. At first, Shadow was everything you'd want in a dog. He was obedient to a fault, following commands as if he understood every word. He never barked, never whined, and seemed content to simply sit and watch us go about our day. Our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, adored him. She'd spend hours playing fetch in the yard, though Shadow never seemed particularly excited about it. He fetched the ball with mechanical precision, dropping it at her feet before sitting back down, his amber eyes scanning the horizon. "He's like a little guardian," Ian joked one evening, as Shadow sat at the foot of Lily's bed, his gaze fixed on the doorway. But there were little things that nagged at me. Shadow's silence, for one. I'd never known a dog to be so quiet. Even his footsteps seemed unnaturally soft, like he wasn't entirely solid. Then there were the nights. I'd wake up at odd hours, feeling like I was being watched. Every time I'd find Shadow sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. "You're being paranoid," Ian said when I brought it up. "He's just a dog." But Shadow didn't feel like just a dog. The first disappearance happened about a month after we brought Shadow home. It was Lily's best friend, Sophie. She'd come over for a play date, and the two girls were inseparable, giggling and running around the yard. That afternoon, I stepped inside to grab some snacks. When I came back out, Lily was alone. "Where's Sophie?" I asked. Lily shrugged. She said she had to go home. Something about her tone felt off, detached, almost rehearsed. I called Sophie's mum, but she said her daughter hadn't come home. The police were called, search parties organised. Weeks passed, and there was no sign of Sophie. The neighbourhood was gripped with fear, but Lily seemed strangely unaffected. "She'll be back," she said one night, stroking Shadow's fur. "Won't she, boy?" Shadow tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the dim light. More people started disappearing. First, it was the mailman. Then the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Each time, Shadow seemed more animated. His movements were smoother, almost human-like, and his amber eyes grew brighter. Ian brushed off my concerns. "It's a coincidence," he said, though even he seemed uneasy around Shadow now. One night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, sipping tea and scrolling through the news on my phone. Shadow lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws. At least that's what I thought. When I glanced down, his eyes were wide open, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Shadow," I whispered. He didn't move. I leaned closer, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in his eyes. A face. Sophie's face. I yelped, pulling back, and Shadow blinked, his eyes returning to their usual amber hue. I started watching him more closely after that. One afternoon, I found Lily in the attic, playing with an old dollhouse. Shadow sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the miniature furniture. "What you doing up here?" I asked. "Shadow wanted to see the dollhouse," Lily said, her voice flat. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Shadow told you that?" She nodded, not looking up. That night, I told Ian we needed to get rid of Shadow. "You're overreacting," he said, though his face was pale. "No, I'm not," I snapped. "Something's wrong with him, Ian. I saw Sophie in his eyes." Ian didn't respond. He just sat there staring at the floor. "I'll take care of it tomorrow," he said finally. But by morning, Ian was gone. The police found his car abandoned by the woods. No signs of struggle, no tracks, nothing. Just gone. I didn't tell them about Shadow. I didn't have to. When they left, I found him sitting in Ian's chair, his amber eyes gleaming. "Where is he?" I demanded. Shadow tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," I screamed, but he just stood and walked away, his tail wagging slowly. It was just me, Lily, and Shadow after that. I tried to get rid of him, left him at the shelter, drove him to the next town over, even tried abandoning him in the woods. But he always came back. Lily, meanwhile, grew more distant. She stopped playing with other kids, stopped talking about Ian. Her whole world became Shadow. One night, I woke to find her bed empty. Panicking, I ran through the house, calling her name. I found her in the attic, sitting in front of the dollhouse. Shadow sat beside her, his eyes glowing like twin embers. "Lily, come here," I said, my voice trembling. She didn't move. "She's staying," Shadow said. I froze. His voice wasn't a growl or a bark. It was a deep, human voice. "Lily, get up," I whispered, but she just smiled. "I like it here," she said. "It's safe." Shadow turned to me, his eyes boring into mine. "You shouldn't have brought me here," he said. The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurring. I stumbled backward, tripping over the attic steps. When I woke up, the house was silent. I never saw Lily again. The police searched, but there was no trace of her or Shadow. Eventually, I sold the house and moved away, but I can't escape him. Every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of black fur out of the corner of my eye, or hear the faint sound of rattling bones in the night. And in my dreams, Shadow waits, his amber eyes glowing, surrounded by the faces of everyone I've lost. Hope you enjoyed the fright. Bloody subscribe to avoid the horrors lurking in the night. Sweet dreams.